Africa's paradoxical poverty, despite its immense natural wealth, is a deeply complex issue that can't be summed up in a few simple explanations. It's a web of historical exploitation, ongoing geopolitical maneuvers, and deep-rooted socio-economic challenges that are hard to unravel. Many people see the continent's vast reserves of oil, diamonds, gold, and other valuable resources and wonder, why isn't Africa rich? To understand this, we need to explore both the internal and external factors that have held Africa back and continue to do so. First, it's crucial to address the elephant in the room: colonialism. Colonialism wasn't just about borders and governance, it was an extraction machine that severely crippled Africa's future development. European powers like Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal took control of African territories, stripping them of resources like rubber, diamonds, copper, and human labor in the form of slavery. This period not only drained Africa's wealth, but also disrupted societal structures and stifled the development of local economies. The infrastructure built during colonial times was designed to facilitate the export of raw materials, not to connect African economies internally or develop industries that could lead to long-term prosperity. So when these nations gained independence, they were left with economies that were structured to benefit the colonizers, not themselves. Take the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most resource-rich countries on the planet. It was brutally exploited by Belgium under King Leopold II, who treated the country as his personal property. Rubber, ivory, and other resources were extracted at an unimaginable human cost. When Belgium finally granted independence in 1960, Congo was left with minimal infrastructure, weak institutions, and deep social divisions. This legacy of plunder and neglect continues to haunt the country today. You'd think that after gaining independence, African nations would have been able to take control of their own destinies, right? Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Instead, the exploitation just became more subtle and sophisticated. Multinational corporations from the West, China, and other emerging powers like India continue to dominate Africa's key industries. These corporations extract billions of dollars worth of oil, minerals, and agricultural products from Africa each year, often paying very little in return. This wealth is repatriated to shareholders in London, New York, or Beijing, while the environmental and social costs are borne by Africans. China, for instance, has become Africa's largest trading partner and investor. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, China has poured billions into African infrastructure projects, from railways to airports. However, many of these projects are financed by loans that African countries can barely afford to repay. When these debts come due, countries like Zambia and Kenya find themselves handing over control of their most valuable assets: mines, ports, and power plants, essentially falling into what many experts call a debt trap. Critics argue that this is just a new form of colonialism, where African countries are becoming beholden to foreign powers in exchange for much-needed infrastructure. But China isn't the only one playing this game. Western companies continue to have a stranglehold on Africa's resources. Take the Niger Delta in Nigeria, for example, where oil extraction by companies like Shell and Chevron has devastated the environment. Local communities have seen little benefit from the billions generated by oil production, while they suffer from oil spills, polluted water, and loss of livelihoods. This is not a new story. It's been happening for decades, with Western multinationals draining Africa's wealth while offering little in return. Africa's natural wealth often turns out to be more of a curse than a blessing. The term resource curse refers to the paradox where countries rich in natural resources tend to have less economic growth and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer resources. Why? Because the wealth generated from these resources often ends up in the hands of a small, corrupt elite, leaving the majority of the population in poverty. In countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea, oil wealth has led to rampant corruption, cronyism, and mismanagement. Leaders use the proceeds from resource extraction to enrich themselves and maintain power, often at the expense of their citizens. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few also fuels conflicts. The Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, has been embroiled in civil wars and armed conflicts for decades, much of it driven by competition for control over the country's vast mineral wealth. Militia groups vie for control over lucrative mines, and foreign companies are more than willing to make deals with warlords and corrupt officials to get their hands on these resources. The result is a cycle of violence and poverty that has left millions dead and displaced. Corruption is a massive obstacle to development in Africa. It's not just about a few corrupt politicians, it's systemic. In many countries, public funds are siphoned off by government officials who use their positions of power to amass personal wealth. This undermines public trust, weakens institutions, and discourages foreign investment. Leaders like Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe and Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, are infamous examples of leaders who plundered their country's resources while their people languished in poverty. Corruption also means that public services, such as healthcare and education, remain underfunded. How can a country build a strong, educated workforce when its schools are crumbling and its teachers are underpaid? How can people escape poverty when hospitals are poorly equipped and healthcare is inaccessible to most of the population? The lack of investment in human capital creates a cycle of poverty that is hard to break. Another factor trapping Africa in poverty is debt. African nations are some of the most heavily indebted in the world, with many relying on loans from international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These loans often come with strings attached, conditions that require countries to implement austerity measures, reduce spending on public services, and privatize state assets. This creates a vicious cycle where countries are forced to take on more loans just to service their existing debt, leaving them with little room to invest in their own development. And it's not just international financial institutions. Countries like China have become major lenders to African nations. While Chinese investment in infrastructure is welcomed by many African governments, it often comes at a high cost. If countries can't repay their loans, they risk losing control over key assets like ports or mining rights to Chinese companies. This brings us to dependency theory, which posits that the economic relationships between developed and developing nations are inherently unequal. Africa exports raw materials, oil, minerals, and agricultural products to the developed world, which then processes these materials into high-value goods and sells them back to Africa. This creates a situation where African nations are locked into a role as exporters of raw materials, unable to develop their own manufacturing sectors and diversify their economies. As a result, they remain dependent on the West, China, and other developed nations for finished goods, technology, and investment. Environmental challenges and climate change. Africa is one of the regions most vulnerable to climate change, even though it contributes the least to global greenhouse gas emissions. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and more frequent droughts are already taking a toll on the continent. In countries like Ethiopia and Kenya, farmers who rely on rain-fed agriculture are struggling to cope with increasingly unpredictable weather. Desertification is spreading in the Sahel, displacing millions of people and exacerbating food insecurity. Flooding in places like Mozambique has caused widespread destruction, further pushing vulnerable populations into poverty. These environmental challenges are compounded by the environmental degradation caused by mining, logging, and oil extraction. In countries like Nigeria, oil spills have polluted rivers and farmlands, destroying livelihoods and pushing people deeper into poverty. The deforestation of the Congo Basin, home to the world's second-largest rainforest, is contributing to global climate change while threatening the livelihoods of indigenous communities who depend on the forest for survival. Hope for the future. Despite these immense challenges, there are glimmers of hope across the continent. Many African countries are making strides in improving governance, reducing corruption, and investing in infrastructure and human capital. Rwanda, for example, has been hailed as a success story, with its government focusing on technological innovation and education. Ghana is another country that has made significant progress in reducing poverty and improving political stability. Africa's young population could be one of its greatest assets in the years to come. With the right investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, the continent could harness the energy and creativity of its young people to drive economic growth and innovation. Africa is also beginning to turn inward, with intra-African trade agreements like the African Continental Free Trade Area, offering the potential to boost trade between African nations and reduce dependence on foreign markets. However, for Africa to truly unlock its potential, both internal reforms and a restructuring of its relationship with the rest of the world are necessary. The continent must break free from the cycles of exploitation, debt, and corruption that have kept it from reaching its full potential. But will the global community allow Africa to do so? And more importantly, will African leaders rise to the challenge of guiding their nations toward a more prosperous future? The question is not just whether Africa is poor, but how long will these systemic forces continue to prevent it from reaching its true potential? How long will foreign powers, multinational corporations, and corrupt elites be allowed to keep Africa's wealth out of the hands of its people?